The jungle was still that night, too still for war. A faint wind moved through the palms, and the sound of crickets carried over the humid air. On a narrow dirt road somewhere in the South Pacific, a small group of American soldiers crouched near a makeshift checkpoint. Their rifles rested on sandbags. A single lantern burned low, its light dimmed by grime and fear. It was 1942, and the war against Japan was in full swing. The Pacific Theater had become a chessboard of islands, each one a brutal contest of survival, intelligence, and deception. Soldiers not only fought in the mud and the rain, they also fought a silent war of wits. For the Japanese military, infiltration was a weapon as deadly as any rifle. For the Americans, one wrong word could mean death. That night, the soldiers were on edge. Orders had come down that Japanese infiltrators, spies, and saboteurs were operating behind the lines. They were said to speak perfect English, wear captured U.S. uniforms, and move among the troops like ghosts. Reports claimed they gathered intelligence, spread confusion, and, in some cases, even directed friendly artillery fire against their own men. Nobody knew who could be trusted. As a pair of figures emerged from the shadows, the sentries raised their rifles. The two men wore U.S. Army fatigues, their helmets slightly askew, their faces streaked with sweat and grime. One carried a Thompson submachine gun, the other a map case. "Identify yourselves," the sergeant barked. "Private Miller and Corporal Davis, sir, from the 32nd Infantry," came the reply, confident and fluent. The sergeant narrowed his eyes. Their accents were good, too good. Something felt off. He couldn't quite place it, but every man on that line had learned to trust his gut more than any written order. The newcomers spoke English like natives, yet there was something missing, something almost mechanical in their tone. A tense silence followed. The sergeant thought fast. The password for the night had already been exchanged earlier. He needed another way to be sure. And then, instinctively, he remembered a new trick that had been passed down through the ranks. A word test so strange and unexpected that only a real American would instinctively understand how to say it. He stepped closer, his rifle slightly raised. "Say the word Lollapalooza." The two men froze. For a second, neither spoke. Then one of them repeated awkwardly, Lollapalooza? The sound was wrong. Every man in the squad knew it instantly. Within seconds, rifles were cocked, orders shouted. The imposters were seized, and the truth came out. They were Japanese infiltrators who had slipped through the lines, trained for months to mimic American speech. But they had never encountered the strange slang and rhythm that Americans used naturally. Lollapalooza was their undoing. That single word, strange and almost comical, became a secret weapon in identifying spies during one of the most chaotic wars in history. But the story of how that word, and others like it, came to save countless lives is rooted in a deeper battle, one fought in classrooms, intelligence rooms, and hearts. The battle to understand language, culture, and identity under the shadow of global war. In 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, the United States was thrust into a conflict that would spread across oceans and continents. Early on, U.S. forces realized that their enemy was cunning, disciplined, and relentless. Japanese intelligence operations were sophisticated, with spies trained in foreign languages and American customs. These agents could blend in among prisoners, infiltrate supply lines, and even confuse communication between Allied units. The Americans, however, had a secret advantage: improvisation. Unlike the rigid structures of the Japanese command, U.S. soldiers came from every background imaginable: farmers from Kansas, musicians from New Orleans, immigrants from New York, and mechanics from Detroit. They spoke in slang, used idioms, and laughed at words that made no sense outside their own culture. To a trained linguist, English could be learned. To a trained spy, it could be imitated. But to a soldier living in the trenches, it was something more. It was instinct. And that's where Lollapalooza came in.
The origin of the word dated back to the early 1900s, long before the war. It was a piece of American slang meaning something extraordinary or unusual. That's a real Lollapalooza. It had no direct translation, no logical pronunciation rules. It rolled off the tongue of a native speaker, but tangled up anyone who had only studied English in a classroom. By 1942, Allied intelligence officers began experimenting with using such nonsense words as linguistic tripwires. Words like squirrel, rural, okra, or Lollapalooza tested not vocabulary but fluency, the rhythm, stress, and instinct of speech. At checkpoints, soldiers would quietly test anyone they didn't recognize with these words. If the suspect hesitated, mispronounced it, or didn't understand its meaning, suspicion fell instantly. There are several accounts of how Lollapalooza specifically became famous. One story traces it to U.S. troops stationed in the Philippines. After a series of deadly infiltrations where Japanese soldiers, disguised as Americans, slipped through lines at night, commanders needed a foolproof test. One linguist officer reportedly suggested a slang word no non-native speaker would ever pronounce naturally. Lollapalooza, he said. That'll trip 'em every time. He was right. In one recorded incident near Buna in New Guinea, an American patrol challenged two men approaching from the darkness. The men answered every question correctly, their units, ranks, even the names of officers. But when asked to say Lollapalooza, they faltered. A quick exchange of gunfire followed. When the bodies were searched, Japanese insignia and documents were found beneath their stolen uniforms. The incident spread like wildfire through the ranks. Soon, Lollapalooza became a legend, a kind of inside joke with deadly consequences. Troops across the Pacific began using it along with similar tongue-twister words as unofficial passwords. To outsiders, it sounded ridiculous. To those who'd faced infiltrators, it was life or death. Japanese intelligence officers soon learned about this phenomenon. They tried to adapt, drilling their men endlessly on pronunciation and slang. But mastering the feeling of a language is not the same as memorizing it. Japanese phonetics didn't include certain sounds used in English, such as the L and R distinction. Many Japanese speakers found it difficult to pronounce both sounds differently under stress. In the heat of a confrontation, nerves betrayed them. Lollapalooza was particularly cruel in that sense. It contained both L's and R-like sounds, back to back, and had no logical rhythm. It wasn't just a password, it was a trap, built from the quirks of culture. Even years later, veterans would recall how that one word symbolized the strange mixture of humor and horror that defined the Pacific War. Soldiers joked about it in letters home, calling it the word that saves your life. But behind the laughter was trauma, because every man who used it remembered why it was needed. Japanese infiltration tactics were no myth. During the early stages of the Pacific Campaign, especially in the Philippines and Guadalcanal, there were several confirmed cases of enemy soldiers disguising themselves as Allied troops. They would sneak into camps, spread misinformation, and sabotage communication lines. The fear of infiltration reached its peak after several tragic incidents where disguised attackers opened fire at close range. From then on, suspicion ran deep. Every checkpoint became a psychological test. Every new face was questioned not only by rank and name, but by accent, attitude, and vocabulary. That paranoia also shaped broader intelligence practices. American forces began developing lists of challenge words that could identify a native English speaker. These lists weren't formal military codes, but spread through units like folklore. Soldiers passed them down. If you're ever unsure, just ask them to say Lollapalooza. For the Japanese, infiltration was a tool of necessity. Facing superior industrial power, Japan relied on stealth and cunning to compensate for a lack of resources. They trained selected soldiers intensively in English, often using captured documents, movies, and radio broadcasts. Some even learned from American prisoners of war. But these crash courses could only go so far. Fluency is built over years of cultural immersion, not weeks of drills. By mid-1943, Allied counterintelligence had refined these methods. They began working with linguists and anthropologists to understand not just language, but behavior. For instance, Americans tended to be casual and direct in conversation. Japanese agents, even when fluent, often maintained rigid formality, an unconscious giveaway. The Lollapalooza test represented the fusion of street smarts and linguistic science. It wasn't created in an office or approved by generals. It emerged organically from the instincts of men on the ground. And yet, it had real psychological power. Imagine being a young soldier in a foreign jungle, hearing footsteps at night, knowing your life depends on a single word. To the Americans, Lollapalooza was more than a test. It was a reassurance that they still had a trick the enemy couldn't copy. As the war dragged on, these cultural tests evolved. In Europe, similar methods were used to detect German infiltrators during the Battle of the Bulge. American troops there used baseball questions, like, "Who won the World Series?" or "What's Mickey Mouse's dog's name?" because no German spy could memorize every detail of American pop culture. In the Pacific, however, Lollapalooza remained unmatched. Its strangeness made it both unrepeatable and unmistakable. For those who survived, it became a symbol of clever resistance, a reminder that sometimes victory doesn't come from firepower, but from understanding the subtleties of human speech. The word Lollapalooza soon became whispered through the ranks like a charm against unseen danger. Young recruits heard it in briefings. Veterans taught it in the field. It wasn't written in any manual, but everyone understood its meaning. It was the unspoken code of survival. In late 1942, American positions across the Pacific were thinly stretched. On the island of Guadalcanal, constant rain turned the battlefields into rivers of mud. Disease spread faster than bullets, and fatigue clouded every decision. The Japanese, determined to reclaim their lost ground, began sending small units behind enemy lines. These groups often moved at night, cutting phone wires, stealing supplies, and gathering intelligence on troop movements.
To make their missions possible, the infiltrators learned to mimic Allied soldiers. They scavenged uniforms from fallen Americans and studied their routines, slang, and hand signals. In one case, Japanese intelligence officers even intercepted radio chatter to understand how American troops addressed one another. They practiced words like buddy, hang on, gotcha, and okay, phrases that carried no direct meaning in textbooks but were part of the living pulse of the language. It worked, at least for a while. Several U.S. outposts reported mysterious incidents. Sentinels vanished, trucks were redirected to the wrong coordinates, and ammunition dumps exploded in the night. Each time, suspicion grew that the Japanese had men who could pass as Americans. The story spread faster than official reports. Soldiers began to imagine invisible enemies all around them. Some swore they saw familiar faces walking through the mist, only to realize later that those friends had been imposters. That was when the test gained its legend. The Lollapalooza method wasn't official. It was born from fear and ingenuity. Yet it soon became one of the most talked about countermeasures in the Pacific. One of the earliest written mentions came from a war correspondent embedded with the 41st Infantry Division. In his notes, he recalled a checkpoint near Sunananda, where sentries stopped 3 soldiers claiming to be from another company. They answered every question with perfect clarity, but when one was asked to say Lollapalooza, he stuttered, replacing the L with an R. The soldiers drew their weapons immediately. A brief scuffle followed, and within moments, the impostors were disarmed. Documents found on them confirmed they were Japanese scouts. The correspondent later wrote, "It was the strangest password I'd ever heard. A carnival word, an American word, pure nonsense to anyone else. And yet it cut through deception like a knife." Word of this encounter reached intelligence officers, who decided to study the phenomenon. A linguist named Colonel Sidney Mashbeer, head of the Allied Translator and Interpreter Section, reportedly approved the informal use of such slang-based challenges.
He knew that pronunciation, especially of L and R sounds, was notoriously difficult for native Japanese speakers. Under stress, those subtle differences became impossible to hide. Mashbeer and his team were already working on another project, training Nisei soldiers, Japanese Americans fluent in both languages, to serve as translators and codebreakers. Ironically, while the Lollapalooza test exposed Japanese infiltrators, Nisei linguists were helping the Allies defeat Japan by mastering their language with perfect accuracy. The duality was striking. On one side, a single word revealing deception. On the other, entire units proving loyalty through language. As the war expanded, intelligence warfare deepened. Each side realized that battles weren't fought only with guns and planes, they were fought through speech, misdirection, and cultural understanding. Japanese agents in the Philippines, posing as Filipino civilians or American deserters, relied on their knowledge of local dialects. In return, Allied soldiers learned to spot subtle clues, how someone pronounced certain letters, how they held a rifle, how they responded to humor. For the Americans, humor became a secret weapon. It was something no spy could easily mimic. During interrogations, U.S. officers often told jokes or used playful slang. Real Americans would chuckle or reply with sarcasm. Imposters usually stayed silent or gave polite, confused answers. Lollapalooza carried the same unpredictable spirit. It wasn't just a word, it was an instinctive test of belonging. By 1943, the stories around it had grown into a kind of folklore. In camps across New Guinea, soldiers told newcomers about the word that saved lives. They joked about creating other similar tests. One unit used the phrase, "rubber baby buggy bumpers," just to amuse themselves and to see if newcomers could say it without stumbling. But not every story ended with laughter. The paranoia also caused tragic mistakes. In the darkness and confusion of jungle warfare, genuine soldiers were sometimes misidentified. A few unfortunate men, disoriented or foreign-born, failed such language tests and were detained, or worse, before the truth emerged. It was a grim reminder that in war, even the smallest misunderstanding could cost a life. Still, the method endured. Commanders justified it with a brutal logic. Better to risk one mistake than let a saboteur slip through. Meanwhile, the Japanese High Command began intensifying linguistic training. They realized that pronunciation errors were exposing their agents. Secret schools in Taiwan and Manchuria were set up to teach English. Students practiced tongue twisters, watched captured American newsreels, and listened to phonograph recordings of U.S. radio programs. They learned to mimic accents from the Midwest, New York, and the South. Yet, no matter how advanced the lessons, one simple truth remained. You cannot train the rhythm of a culture. To speak like an American soldier in 1942 meant to embody sarcasm, improvisation, and a certain reckless humor born of hardship. The Japanese approach to language, rooted in precision and respect, couldn't replicate that chaos.
In 1944, when American forces recaptured the Philippines, intelligence units again reported infiltrators using perfect English. They fooled a few sentries at first, but the slightest hesitation, a wrong intonation, or an unnatural word choice betrayed them. Once again, slang became the frontline defense. In one report filed by the 25th Infantry Division, a sergeant described how he caught an imposter by asking him what he thought of baseball season. The infiltrator's confusion was instant. The sergeant didn't need more proof. It was this improvisational brilliance, testing knowledge of pop culture, slang, and humor, that defined the American approach. Lollapalooza remained the most famous example, but it symbolized a broader truth. Language is identity. During the height of the war, the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the precursor to the CIA, began compiling psychological profiles on how language could reveal cultural background. Their findings were remarkable. Even when two people spoke the same words fluently, their emotional rhythms differed. Under pressure, people reverted to their native cadence, tone, and thought patterns. A fluent but non-native speaker might pronounce every word correctly, but pause at the wrong time, stress the wrong syllable, or miss the subtle music of a phrase. Lollapalooza worked precisely because it had rhythm before meaning. To an American, it sounded like a swing-era exclamation. To a foreigner, it was a tongue twister without logic. By war's end, the Allies had begun formalizing similar techniques in training manuals. They called them language challenge tests. Some were based on pronunciation, others on idioms. Lollapalooza, though never officially codified, became the unofficial mascot of these methods. When the war finally ended in 1945, soldiers returning home carried many stories, some tragic, some absurd. The Lollapalooza test lived on as a curious anecdote. Veterans recounted it at reunions, laughing about how one silly word could decide life or death. Newspapers occasionally printed human interest stories about it, highlighting the creativity and wit of American troops. But beneath the humor was a profound lesson about communication. Language, in its deepest form, is culture. You can study grammar for years, but without the instinct of belonging, the way people bend rules, play with words, and share inside jokes, you remain an outsider. Decades later, linguists would analyze this phenomenon scientifically. They found that second language speakers, no matter how fluent, process speech differently in the brain. Under extreme stress, their pronunciation tends to revert toward their native patterns. During wartime, when adrenaline surges, even the most disciplined spy could stumble over a word like Lollapalooza. Some historians argue that the story of the word has been exaggerated, a myth inflated by retelling. But whether myth or memory, it reflected a genuine reality. American forces relied on cultural familiarity as a defense weapon. And it wasn't limited to the Pacific. During the Battle of the Bulge in Europe, German commandos disguised as American MPs used captured uniforms to sow chaos. They changed road signs, misdirected convoys, and even spread false orders. The U.S. response was eerily similar to what had worked in the Pacific. Language tests. American troops in Belgium began asking suspected soldiers questions that only true Americans could answer. Who's the president's wife? What's the capital of Illinois? What team plays at Wrigley Field? The tests weren't perfect, but they worked more often than not. The idea was the same: identity expressed through language, not rank or uniform. In this way, Lollapalooza transcended its own setting. It became part of a global wartime philosophy. Trust the speech, not the disguise. By 1945, when Japan surrendered, the word had traveled far beyond the battlefield. It appeared in diaries, letters, and even military lectures. One intelligence officer reportedly joked, "If there's ever another war, I'll make sure every recruit learns how to say Lollapalooza before they learn to shoot." The guns finally fell silent in August 1945. Across the Pacific, jungle outposts and island garrisons received the unbelievable message that Japan had surrendered. The war that had consumed millions of lives was over. But for the men who had fought in the dark, where a single word could mean the difference between trust and betrayal, peace felt strange. The habits of suspicion didn't vanish overnight. Even in the celebration that followed, soldiers joked nervously about passwords and accents. Somewhere in the Philippines, a platoon sergeant scrawled the word Lollapalooza on his helmet and laughed. To him, it wasn't just slang, it was survival. As veterans returned home, the stories of the Lollapalooza test spread quietly among them. It became one of those almost unbelievable tales that perfectly captured the absurdity of war. A word used in carnivals, in songs, and in jazz bars had somehow become a weapon against the enemy. Newspapers picked up on it. In 1946, Stars and Stripes ran a short piece titled "The Word That Fooled the Enemy." It described how soldiers in the Pacific had used American slang as an impromptu spy detector. The article quoted one unnamed officer who said,
You could teach a man English, but you couldn't teach him to sound American under fire.
That simple sentence summed up the entire wartime philosophy behind linguistic testing. For military linguists and psychologists, the war had proven something extraordinary. Language is not just a tool for communication, it's a fingerprint of culture, emotion, and thought. Even two people speaking identical words could reveal completely different histories through their rhythm, tone, and hesitation. The U.S. military, recognizing this, began to formalize linguistic and cultural training after the war. The newly created Central Intelligence Agency in the late 1940s adopted some of the same principles used in the field. Agents were trained to detect stress patterns, micropauses, and pronunciation errors that hinted at non-native origins. The word Lollapalooza itself was occasionally mentioned in early lectures on wartime field intelligence, half joke, half legend. But the story also raised ethical questions. As decades passed, historians began revisiting the Pacific War's darker chapters: internment camps, racial fear, and the suspicion that had gripped soldiers in those uncertain jungles. Some argued that the Lollapalooza method, while clever, also reflected the era's deep mistrust and stereotyping. Others disagreed. They said it wasn't about race, it was about instinct. In a war where uniforms lied and propaganda blurred truth, soldiers needed something unbreakable. For them, language was that anchor. Interviews with surviving veterans decades later revealed the emotional complexity behind it. One Marine recalled, "You didn't think about politics or prejudice. You just thought, that word might save me." And sometimes it did. In the 1950s and 60s, as the Cold War began, the lessons of the Pacific War evolved into more scientific disciplines. Linguists studied accent recognition, phonetic stress, and even deception detection through speech. The same principles that had guided jungle checkpoints now formed the foundation of modern interrogation and counterintelligence. Lollapalooza became a case study in every sense, a demonstration of how cultural knowledge could outperform technology. Machines could decode messages, but only a human ear could catch the tremor of hesitation that betrayed a lie. Beyond the military, the word found a strange second life in popular culture. In 1991, when musician Perry Farrell named his alternative rock festival Lollapalooza, few realized that the name had once been used as a wartime password. To most people, it simply meant something extraordinary or wild, but to a handful of aging veterans watching from their living rooms, the name stirred memories of nights in the jungle and the quiet tension of checkpoint encounters. One of those veterans, in a 1995 interview, chuckled when asked about the coincidence. "Back then," he said, "Lollapalooza didn't mean music, it meant life or death. You said it right, you lived. You said it wrong, you didn't." That blunt truth still resonates today, because the story of Lollapalooza isn't just about a word, it's about identity in its purest form. Language, after all, is history. Every accent, every turn of phrase carries generations of memory. It tells where we've been, what we've survived, and what we belong to. In wartime, that belonging became a test sharper than any weapon. Historians later pieced together multiple accounts of similar linguistic challenges across the Pacific and Europe. They found that the Lollapalooza story wasn't unique, it was part of a broader phenomenon. In every army, soldiers learned to trust the subtleties of language. The British used cricket references. The French used idioms only locals knew. Americans, with their patchwork of slang and humor, used words like Lollapalooza. The power of such tests lay not in complexity, but in unpredictability. A spy could memorize phrases, but not feel them. Infiltrators were trained to be perfect. Real soldiers were gloriously imperfect, sarcastic, impulsive, spontaneous. That was something no spy school could ever reproduce. As time passed, linguists began using terms like cultural fluency and phonetic stress identity to describe what soldiers had instinctively practiced decades earlier. They discovered that every language carries unconscious patterns, tiny pauses, emphasis, and melody that differ between cultures. Under pressure, those patterns become visible. In modern times, these findings have shaped advanced voice recognition systems and psychological analysis tools, but none of them are as poetic or as raw as the image of a soldier in 1942 whispering a strange word into the darkness, waiting to hear if the other man would stumble. In 2018, a small military history museum in Texas dedicated a display to wartime slang and language intelligence. One of the centerpiece panels read, "The Word That Exposed Spies, Lollapalooza." Beneath it hung a faded photograph of soldiers at a jungle checkpoint. The caption told the short version of the story, how a bizarre American word became a password that no enemy could fake. Visitors often laughed at first. Then, as they read further, they fell silent. Because behind the humor was something haunting. The soldiers who used that word were young, barely out of high school. They didn't know linguistics or phonetics or strategy. They just knew that the war had turned trust into a gamble. And in that gamble, they'd found a small, strange way to tilt the odds in their favor. Some of them never returned home. Their stories lived on in rumors and anecdotes. But every time a veteran mentioned Lollapalooza, it wasn't just nostalgia, it was a code for survival. Even today, military intelligence schools teach the importance of linguistic instinct. Instructors tell recruits that knowing a language isn't enough. You have to understand the people who speak it, their jokes, their rhythms, their emotions. Without that, fluency is only imitation.
The Lollapalooza story serves as a timeless reminder of that truth. It teaches that culture, not technology, often makes the decisive difference in war. And perhaps that's the most human lesson of all. Wars are fought by nations, but won by individuals who think on their feet, who invent, adapt, and sometimes just say the right word at the right time.